I'd like to address a few questions regarding the future of studies in my own field of African pastoralism and the arid lands into the future, and in particular the role of African anthropology. I'd have to say that the fields of both these areas have changed since I began to do my own research and my own work. And that, of course, isn't just the internal dynamic of the fields of anthropology and African studies. It has to do with the changing conditions of life in Africa. And we can't pretend that we can pursue the same sort of questions and issues and use the same perspectives that we might have had 30, 40 years ago. I mentioned earlier the fact that we can't think of societies as being relatively autonomous. Of course, they do have a certain autonomy that by virtue of speaking a language and having various social parameters, they have a certain autonomy. I don't think that should be denied. But at the same time, they're part of regions. There is intermarriage back and forth. They have interethnic relations. They are part of states. They have boundaries that come from the state and represent international frontiers, and they are part of a global society. We could, when I first started work, we could almost think that there were some people, non-literate, living local lives, who weren't quite sure what America was, or what they usually knew Ulaya because they had been the ones to colonize them, Ulaya being the term for European. But there wasn't a great deal of information about the rest of the world. And today, there's nobody who doesn't know something about the rest of the world and isn't impacted by global forces, global influences, global culture. And in most cases, they feel part of a global culture. So if I was to say, where would studies that pertain to nomadic pastoralists, where should they go? What are the questions that are opening up? I would mention a few things. One is international land grabbing, which is a phenomena. It's on a massive scale. It's of great importance. And some of the areas that are, in some sense, vulnerable or open for being appropriated by outside interests are in the rangelands. Certainly, if you go to Ethiopia, the areas in the southwestern area around the Omo Valley and other areas are vulnerable to be taken up and essentially agro-pastoralists pushed aside. So pastoralists, because of their relatively low population densities and the manner of using mobility, are especially vulnerable to being displaced. They also have relatively little voice in national capitals, and so that they don't quite have the defenses at that level that other populations might have. We see South Sudan, a new nation. Of course, it's embroiled in civil war right now, but they have given out immense millions of hectares of land to international agribusinesses to come in and use. And it's extraordinary when we think back that in the colonial period, the struggle in these nations against colonialism was invariably give us our land back. And now in a period of post-colonialism, governments are saying, who wants land? Here it is. And I think this is one of the very most important questions and problems that are going to be faced, and anthropology has to be there ready to do its part. It's one aspect of our work is looking at international land grabbing. Of certainly questions regarding refugees. in pastoral areas for various reasons, because they're across borders, and because they're in particular types of arid lands, tend to be vulnerable to conflict, and they tend to generate refugees. And so the linkage between refugees and the conditions of their departure and the structural mechanisms of accommodating them, I think we're going to see these problems only increase. We have, Kenya has one of the largest number of refugees populations in the world, and that's coming from Somalia, it's coming from the Sudan, coming from Ethiopia, and of course there is transfers back the other way. So the question of people who are displaced, now we're talking about refugees, usually they're usually related to conflict, but there are also people who are displaced or are dispossessed by other mechanisms, some of which I discussed earlier regarding land rights. This will be an important issue into the future. A third I might mention we're actually involved in. One aspect of social change is the movement of the problem of wildlife and other natural resources being protected within national parks and reserves in what's come to be called fortress conservation. This is evolving into forms of community conservation. In principle, what it means is that people who have been lost access to those resources because the state has created a national park, one way back in to make use of resources or to profit from them in some way or another is community conservation. So we're currently involved in a project which is in southern Kenya, northern Tanzania, which is an area of probably the greatest biodiversity in the world, especially with regard to major wildlife populations. So we're looking across different conditions under which community conservation is being pursued, relationships of a community that's engaged with land tenure. Is it held privately? Is it held by one person or a group of people? Is it part of a community effort? Is it a trust, which is a coming together of private holdings where they agree that we're going to manage it together, et cetera? So we're looking at the land tenure dimensions. And of course, the compatibility of wildlife and livestock is a crucial issue. The wildlife proponents of national parks will say we have to get the livestock out of the way. But if we look over a very long period of time, why is it that wildlife and livestock tend to occupy the same areas? You might say, well, they both want grazing. It's obvious. And of course, that is true. But there's another dimension, which is that livestock, in fact, are engines of creating a certain environment. And that environment is the one that wildlife want. So you can see, and there's been some wonderful work outside of the Serengeti, you can see livestock grazing in one area, and you see the wildlife coming in right behind. Because effectively, the trampling down of bushlands and the trimming of grasses, because if grasses grow too much, it's not a good thing, it's a bad thing. Basically, it creates a non-palatable and non-nutritious source of nutrition. So there's a strong ecological argument to say that there can be a managed reciprocity of land use between the two wildlife and livestock. So we're looking at these questions, but I think this will continue being an important issue because the international conservation initiatives are strong. To be a good person in our society, we have to support conservation and for good reason. On the other hand, two too rarely do people think about the effects on human populations and think hard about the compatibility that can exist between tourism on the one hand, managing wildlife and livestock, et cetera. We don't like to think of the land grabbing, which is a voracious process, as associated with conservation, but it is. So it's something we call green grabbing, which is to use conservation ideas basically to say we should be controlling, we the conservationists should be controlling this land, and we're going to get it. So something like the Nature Conservancy as a marvelous example of people who, I guess it's probably good that they're doing much of what they do, which is to buy up land and pay for easements which constrain how people are going to use their land in ways that are wildlife conducive. And yet what they're doing in areas of Africa, using first world assets, are investing and buying land from peasants whose asset base is much narrower. So what can, if we treat land values as equivalent between Europe and North America, equivalent to Africa, who can avoid having all that land fall into the hands of the international, capital, essentially. So I think this is a major issue, and you might say, well, the economists and the political scientists should be on that one. True, but there's still, it comes right down to the grassroots and into areas of impact that anthropologists have some sort of, special expertise. So those are three areas that I think are important. Of course, international development. How can we envision the arid lands in ways that will sustain growing populations and will create the conditions for improved nutrition, improved health, and yet see this as relying on the rock of animal production so that people themselves are not displaced. And in fact, there has been some work, some very interesting work, that has compared sedentary populations in terms of nutrition and health with continuing mobile populations. And one of the ideas is that people should settle so they can get nutritious food, and they'll be better off. Well, it turns out it's the opposite, because when they settle, they lose access to the most nutritious foods, which is livestock-based. They become dependent on food aid, and food aid is often much less nutritious. It has to do with grains and let's say maize and no milk. So in fact, you compare it, you can see in the nutritional and health markers of children, they're better off continuing to nomadize. That doesn't mean they all will, because they also have interests in schools, and there are things that sedentary life can produce, but somehow getting a compromise. I think it's a challenge. I don't think we have the answer yet, but it's we should recognize that as a very serious problem. And I guess the last thing I would mention would be the question of citizenship. Where do people belong in the world? And the pastoralists increasingly recognize themselves as citizens of the world, that there are people out there, and they owe some of this to the indigenous peoples movement, the Permanent Forum in New York, which has said, you are worthy, and they increasingly see themselves that way, and when sometimes local discourse would suggest that they are less worthy. But they have education, they have information, they're increasingly using communication technology. You can imagine how cell phones have begun to revolutionize, herding livestock, where you don't have to go there to see if there's grass. You call your friend and he tells you. So they're part and parcel of the global scene. I would mention religious change as well with regard to that. They're increasingly continuing to practice the magnificent system of ritual and age sets is hard because people are increasingly members of evangelical churches, and the evangelical churches tend to be quite intolerant about the propagation of customary practices. And that's something that I'm, quite critical of because I think this is, absolutely an extraordinary system of ideas and practices that needs its own attention and respect. But what do they gain from evangelical Christianity? One thing that I've been able to see is that they do feel part of the world, rather than feeling that they are, increasingly impoverished people in a corner and they've only got themselves. They are suddenly part of a global phenomena, so they have something to share with people throughout the world. And of course, there is enough of a flow of preachers here and there that they're pastoralists in a small, dusty area will have somebody come and they'll send somebody there. I've got a good Maasai friend, by the way, I met him years ago, and he became a priest, and then he became a bishop, and he lives in the United States. He has a whole set of churches in South Carolina, and he has a whole set of churches in Kenya, and he's on Facebook with me. So, this I think is something to be considered. What is it that allows people to feel that in a time of stress, they are part of a global community, and this religion has offered one means, education as another, and of course participating in the commodity economy. We can be critical of it, but at least it's out there, and everybody can take part in some way or another. So these are, I think, a few challenges for pastoral peoples, and a few essentially the essence of an important research program for the future. Thank you.